When the notary slid open the heavy manila envelope with a silver letter opener, my daughter, Julianne, leaned back in her leather chair, crossed her legs, and adjusted her gold watch with a cold, triumphant smile. Across the polished mahogany table, my son, David, reached out and clutched his wife's hand, whispering something that made them both laugh under their breath. They thought it was over. They genuinely believed they had stripped me of my dignity, my home, and the 90-acre commercial apple orchard and cider mill I had spent 42 years pouring my sweat and blood into. So, as outlined in the primary deed transfer, Julianne said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy as she looked toward the notary, my father is voluntarily signing over full title ownership of Sterling Orchards to David and me today. We've already arranged for a private senior living suite in the city. Dad, you don't have to worry about managing the land anymore. You're 67. It's time to rest. I sat at the end of the table, wearing my best flannel shirt and the heavy leather boots I had worn through 4 decades of spring harvests. I didn't yell, I didn't bang my fist on the table. I just looked into the eyes of the 2 children my late wife Martha and I had sacrificed everything to raise. You really think you've won, don't you, Julianne? I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. David smirked, tapping his manicured fingers against his leather folder. Dad, the valuation came in at $4.2 million. The earnest check is already in escrow. We have the medical evaluation from Dr. Sterling. We have the power of attorney documents you signed after Mom's funeral. And we have the primary deed right here. It's done. Don't make this embarrassing for yourself. The notary, a quiet, gray-haired man named Arthur Vance, who had known my family since 1985, didn't smile. He set the signed primary deed aside, looked up at my children over his half-moon reading glasses, and then slowly reached into his battered brown leather briefcase. Before we finalize the land transfer registries, Arthur said, his tone thick and heavy, there is one administrative requirement that must be fulfilled under the original trust framework established by your parents. Julianne frowned, her triumphant expression flickering for a fraction of a second. What requirement? We signed the transfer deed. I hold Dad's medical power of attorney. The matter is done. Arthur pulled out a thick sealed parchment packet wrapped in faded red cotton string and stamped with a heavy wax seal. He set it squarely in the center of the mahogany desk, right between my children and me. My children thought they had won everything, I said, looking David straight in the eyes as Arthur broke the wax seal, until the notary opened the second envelope. To understand how my own blood could sit across a conference table and look at me with such icy, transactional greed, you have to go back 9 months.
My name is Arthur Sterling. For over 40 years, Sterling Orchards was the pride of our county in upstate New York. I started in 1982 with 20 acres of dead soil, a rusty tractor, and a mortgage that kept me awake until 3 in the morning every night. Martha and I worked side by side. When her hands bled from pruning trees in freezing February rain, she never complained. When I worked 18-hour shifts during the autumn pressing season, she brought hot soup to the barn and sat with me on wooden crates. Together, we grew those 20 acres into a sprawling 90-acre estate featuring high-density heirloom apple crops, a historic timber frame pressing mill, a retail farm market, and a bottling distribution line that supplied cider across 3 states. We paid off every dime of debt. We were completely free. When Martha passed away 3 years ago from aggressive lung cancer, a piece of my soul went into the dirt with her. I was devastated, hollowed out, and vulnerable. That was when Julianne and David began hovering. At first, their concern looked like love.
Julianne, 34, an ambitious real estate broker in the city, started visiting every weekend. She brought pre-made meals, cleaned the kitchen, and sat on the porch asking about my blood pressure. David, 32, an executive at an asset management firm, began going over my accounting ledgers, offering to simplify my banking so I wouldn't have to drive into town. "Dad, you're grieving," Julianne had told me 6 months after the funeral, wrapping a warm blanket around my shoulders as we sat on the porch, looking over the orchards. "Grief makes a man blind. In my heartbreak, I trusted them. I signed what I believed was a routine financial proxy, allowing David to pay the orchard's utility bills and property taxes directly from our farm operating account. I didn't realize I had handed my children the keys to my own execution. The subtle betrayals began 3 months ago. Small things at first. I went to order $10,000 worth of organic fertilizer for the spring planting, only for our local farm supply store manager, Tim, to pull me aside with a worried expression. "Arthur, your business credit line was frozen," Tim said, leaning over the counter. "David called the bank last Tuesday and flagged the operating account. He told them you were showing signs of cognitive confusion and making unauthorized large withdrawals." I stood there, feeling the blood drain from my face. "Cognitive confusion? I've bought fertilizer from you every March for 30 years, Tim." "I know, Arthur," Tim said softly, shaking his head, "but David presented a temporary financial guardianship document signed by a notary in the city. You need to talk to your son." When I called David that evening, his tone wasn't apologetic. It was smooth, cold, and calculated.
"Dad, it's for your own safety," David said. The background noise of a bustling steakhouse hummed over the line. "You're spending thousands on fertilizer when the orchard isn't even profitable anymore. We need to streamline operations. Julianne and I are coming down this weekend to discuss your future." That weekend, they arrived not as my children, but as corporate liquidators. Sitting in my living room, the same living room where they had unwrapped Christmas presents as children, Julianne dropped a heavy white binder onto the coffee table. "We have an offer from Sunburst Development Group," Julianne announced, her voice flat and businesslike. "They want the full 90 acres. They're offering $4.2 million to clear the land and build a gated 70-unit luxury residential community. The orchard, the pressing mill, the old barn, it all gets cleared." I stared at her, feeling a sick, heavy nausea rise in my throat. "Demolish the orchard? Julianne, your grandfather planted those northern spy trees in the South Block. Your mother designed the retail market with her own hands. That land pays the salaries of 8 full-time workers." "Those workers can find other jobs, Dad," David snapped, stepping forward. "You're living in a romantic fantasy. The cider industry is shrinking. The taxes are eating us alive. We're 34 and 32 years old, Dad. That $4.2 million changes our lives. Why are you holding us back for a bunch of trees?" "It's not just trees, David," I shouted, my voice breaking with an agonizing mix of rage and sorrow. "It's our family's identity. It's your mother's legacy." "Mom is dead," Julianne spat out, her eyes narrowing into cold slits, "and you are getting too old to know what's good for this family. We already spoke to Dr. Sterling, Mom's second cousin. He signed a preliminary evaluation stating that your grief has manifested as progressive executive dysfunction. If you don't sign the voluntary transfer papers, we will file for full involuntary legal conservatorship in county court on Monday. You will be declared incompetent, the land will be sold anyway, and you will spend the rest of your life in an assisted living facility while we take control of the proceeds." I looked from my daughter to my son. There was no warmth in their eyes. No hesitation, no lingering childhood affection, just raw, unadulterated financial greed. They saw their aging father not as a human being who had given them everything, but as an annoying obstacle standing between them and a multi-million-dollar payout. "You would really do that to me?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You would put your father in an institution for money?"
"It's not about hurting you, Dad," David said, softening his voice into a chilling, patronizing fake comfort. "It's about securing our future. Sign the papers next Friday at Arthur Vance's office. Let us handle the sale, and we'll buy you a nice 2-bedroom condo near the coast. You can sit on the balcony and read books." They left that night, leaving me alone in the dark, quiet house. I sat at the kitchen table until 4 in the morning, staring at an old framed photograph of Martha holding Julianne and David when they were toddlers in the pumpkin patch. My heart felt as though it were being crushed between 2 millstones. I wept, not for the land, but for the devastating realization that I had raised children who viewed my life's work as nothing more than a bank account waiting to be plundered. The next morning, I did something my children didn't expect. I didn't panic. I didn't scream. I didn't hire a flashy city lawyer to start a loud, messy court battle that would drag my family's name through the dirt. Instead, I put on my coat and drove down to the old brick building on Main Street to see Arthur Vance. Arthur Vance had been our family notary and estate lawyer for nearly 40 years. He was 71, quiet, methodical, and fiercely loyal to Martha and me. When I sat down in his office and told him what David and Julianne were doing, Arthur slammed his pen onto his desk, his weathered face flushing red with anger. "Those arrogant, ungrateful little fools," Arthur whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "David came into my office 3 weeks ago asking for copies of your property deeds, claiming you were planning to sell the South Orchard to pay off imaginary gambling debts. I knew he was lying." "They have Dr. Sterling's medical evaluation, Arthur," I said, leaning forward, resting my tired hands on my knees. "Julianne has a real estate power of attorney draft. They told me if I don't sign the voluntary land transfer deed on Friday, they'll drag me into probate court and declare me mentally unfit." Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, staring at me intently. "And what do you want to do, Arthur? Do you want me to file an emergency injunction? We can fight the conservatorship." "No," I said quietly, a strange, calm clarity settling over me. "If we fight them in open court, they will bring in slick attorneys, drag Martha's name into it, and stall the orchard's operations until we go bankrupt. I want them to bring the land transfer deed to your office on Friday. I want them to think they have backed me into a corner. I want them to bring their developers, their legal threats, and their absolute confidence." Arthur frowned, puzzled. "Arthur, if you sign that voluntary transfer deed without a defense, they will legally own 90% of the real estate title. They can sell it to Sunburst Development within 24 hours. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather notebook, the notebook Martha had kept during her final year of life. "They don't know everything, Arthur," I said softly, a faint, sad smile touching my lips. "They think they know every document in this farm because they raided my desk after the funeral, but they forgot about the agreement Martha and I made in 1998 when we took out the expansion loan." Arthur stared at me for 3 long seconds. Then, slowly, his eyes widened as a realization hit him like a bolt of thunder. "The secondary trust covenant," Arthur whispered, his breath catching. "The 1998 deed restructuring." "You kept it in your safe, didn't you?" I asked. Arthur stood up, walked over to the massive iron safe in the corner of his office, and spun the combination dial. He opened the heavy door, reached into the bottom shelf, and pulled out a thick, yellowed envelope sealed with red wax. "I've kept it right here for 26 years, Arthur said, holding the envelope with reverent care, just as Martha instructed. "Keep it sealed until Friday," I told him. "Let them sign their deeds, let them celebrate their victory, and then
open the second envelope. The next 4 days were a test of emotional endurance. David called every morning, checking to see if I was preparing for the move. He spoke to me like a child, asking if I needed help packing my clothes from the house. Julianne dropped by the farm on Wednesday with a young man in a tailored suit, an inspector from Sunburst Development. I watched from the barn doorway as Julianne walked the developer across the pristine green rows of apple trees, pointing toward the south ridge. "We can clear this entire orchard block in 3 days," Julianne told the inspector, her voice carrying over the afternoon breeze. I stood in the shadows of the wooden barn, my hands gripping the oak frame until my knuckles turned white. It took every ounce of emotional strength in my body not to walk out there and confront her. But I stayed quiet. I remembered Martha's patience. I knew that true justice didn't come from screaming. It came from truth. On Thursday evening, my son-in-law, Mark, Julianne's husband, came to the house alone. Mark was a quiet, honest carpenter who had always treated me with respect. He walked into the kitchen carrying a box of tools he had borrowed from my workshop months ago. "Arthur," Mark said, his voice quiet, filled with deep discomfort, "I brought your tools back. I wanted to say I'm sorry." I poured him a cup of coffee and pushed it across the table. "You don't have to apologize for Julianne, Mark." Mark sat down, staring into his black coffee, his face pale. "I tried to talk to her, Arthur. I told her what she and David are doing to you is evil. I told her this farm is your life, but she won't listen. She's obsessed with the money. She's already put a down payment on a penthouse downtown using a short-term bridge loan secured against her expected share of the development payout." I looked at Mark, noticing a red flag in his words. A bridge loan? Julianne took out a bridge loan before the land was even sold? Mark nodded grimly. $250,000. The interest rate is insane. David did the same thing. He pledged his portfolio assets to secure a commercial margin loan for a venture capital startup that failed last month. Arthur, they aren't just selling the farm because they're greedy. They're selling it because they are both in catastrophic debt. If this deal with Sunburst Development doesn't close by Friday afternoon, David faces personal bankruptcy, and Julianne's lender will begin foreclosing on her property. The last piece of the puzzle fell into place with a terrifying, crystal-clear click. Their fake love, their fake concern for my health, their desperate push for a conservatorship. It wasn't just cold ambition. It was the frantic, panicked theft of two desperate gamblers who were willing to destroy their father's life to save themselves from their own financial ruin. "Thank you for telling me the truth, Mark," I said quietly, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "Are you going to be okay tomorrow, Arthur?" asked Mark, looking at me with genuine concern. I picked up my coffee cup, looked out the window at the quiet, moonlit rows of apple trees, and took a slow sip. "Tomorrow, Mark, the truth will set everybody free." That brings us back to Friday morning in Arthur Vance's conference room. The atmosphere in the room was suffocatingly tense. On one side of the table sat Julianne, wearing her high-end designer business suit, and David, grinning like a man who had just won the lottery. Beside them was Mr. Henderson, the chief legal counsel for Sunburst Development, holding a binder full of closing contracts and a cashier's check for $4.2 million. On my side sat only me and old Arthur Vance. Julianne had just finished watching me place my signature on the primary land transfer deed, the document that surrendered my personal ownership of the 90 acres to my 2 children. "There," Julianne said, taking the signed primary deed and sliding it toward the developer's lawyer. "The title is transferred. Mr. Henderson, you can issue the closing escrow checks now."
David grinned, leaning back in his chair. "Congratulations, Dad. You did the right thing. We'll have the movers at the house by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to clear out your stuff." "Not so fast," Arthur Vance said, calmly. The room went completely quiet. Julianne snapped her eyes toward the notary, her brow furrowing into angry lines. "What do you mean, not so fast? The deed is signed and notarized. The transfer is complete." Arthur didn't answer her. He deliberately reached into his briefcase, pulled out the second envelope, the yellowed parchment packet wrapped in faded red string, and picked up his silver letter opener. "Arthur, what is this nonsense?" David demanded, stepping forward, his voice rising in irritation. "We don't have time for your administrative games. We have a bank closing at 2 o'clock. "Silence, Mr. Sterling," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a deep, commanding register that made even the developer's attorney sit up straight. "As the appointed executor of the Sterling Family Trust and a sworn officer of the court, I am required by law to read all governing covenants attached to this real estate title before any commercial conveyance can be legally recorded." With a sharp slice, Arthur cut the red string and opened the second envelope. He pulled out a heavy parchment document stamped with a dark green corporate seal dated September 14, 1998. "What you hold in your hands, Julianne and David," Arthur declared, looking directly at my children, "is the primary land deed you just signed. But what I hold in my hands is the 1998 Irrevocable Agricultural Land Trust Deed, executed jointly by Arthur Sterling and his late wife, Martha Sterling." Julianne's face went pale. What does that mean?" Arthur adjusted his reading glasses and began reading aloud, his voice echoing through the silent room. "Be it known to all parties that Sterling Orchards, comprising 90 acres of commercial agricultural property, is hereby placed under the permanent stewardship of the Martha Sterling Agricultural Heritage Trust. Section 4, subsection B explicitly states, in the event of any voluntary or involuntary transfer of individual title ownership, full administrative voting authority, sale authorization, and land usage conversion rights shall immediately and automatically vest exclusively in the trust's designated perpetual managing trustee." David jumped out of his chair, his face turning beet red. "That's impossible! Dad was the sole owner. We searched his desk. We checked the county clerk's public registry." "You checked the primary tax registry, David," Arthur replied with a cold, triumphant smile. "Your mother and father created this trust 26 years ago to ensure that no single family member, including themselves, could ever sell this historic land to commercial developers without the explicit written consent of the managing trustee." Julianne was breathing heavily now, her cold composure completely shattering. She leaned across the table, her fingernails digging into the polished wood. "Who is the trustee? Is it Dad?" "No," Arthur said softly, leaning back. "Your father surrendered his individual trustee rights 3 days ago to protect the farm's legal neutrality." Arthur reached into the envelope and pulled out the final signed appointment document. "The sole irrevocable managing trustee of the Martha Sterling Agricultural Heritage Trust," Arthur announced, "is your brother-in-law, Mark Davis." "What?" Julianne screamed, her voice cracking into a high-pitched shriek. She spun around, staring at her husband, who was sitting quietly in the back corner of the room. "Mark, you knew about this?" Mark stood up slowly, looking at his wife with a mixture of sadness and quiet resolve. "I found out yesterday, Julianne. Arthur called me into his office and showed me the trust terms your mother wrote before she died. Your mother wanted this orchard to remain a community farm forever. She wanted it protected from people who care more about money than family. "You backstabbing idiot!" David yelled, lunging toward Mark, but the developer's attorney immediately stepped between them, holding up his hands. "Hold on," Mr. Henderson shouted, his eyes wide with professional horror as he looked at the trust documents on the table. "Mr. Vance, are you saying that this transfer deed signed by Arthur today conveys ownership to the children but zero rights to sell, divide, or change the land use from commercial agriculture?"
"Dad, please!" Brandon cried out, rushing toward the wooden railings separating the gallery from the bench, tears streaming down his face as the bailiff stepped in front of him. "Dad, they're going to arrest me! Harbor National will call the loan. I'll lose my house. I'll go to prison. Please, Dad, you have to save me. I'm your son." I stood up slowly from my chair, leaning on my cane. I walked over to the wooden railing and looked my 35-year-old son in the eyes. The emotional power shift was absolute. The arrogant, cold young man who had stood in my office 3 days ago, telling me I was too old to make decisions, was now a sobbing, broken wreck, begging the father he had betrayed to rescue him from his own grave. "I loved you, Brandon," I said, my voice quiet, trembling with a heartbreaking, quiet dignity. "I gave you my youth, my hard work, and my trust. If you had come to me, if you had been honest about your debts, I would have helped you. I would have worked extra shifts to help you pay off your mistakes. But you didn't want my help. You wanted to declare me insane and destroy everything your mother and I built." "Dad, I'm sorry. I was desperate. Alyssa pressured me." Brandon wept, grabbing at the wooden railing, his hands shaking violently. "A man makes his own choices, Brandon," I whispered, tears finally slipping down my cheeks. "And a man lives with the consequences. You said I was too old to make decisions, but today the law made the decision for both of us." I turned my back on my son. I walked out of courtroom 3B alongside Samuel Albright and Ethan, leaving Brandon's frantic, hysterical cries echoing off the marble walls behind us. The legal and personal fallout was absolute. Within 3 months, the district attorney filed formal criminal charges against Brandon for commercial loan fraud, falsification of corporate records, and attempted elder financial exploitation. To avoid a long prison sentence, Brandon entered a guilty plea to reduced felony charges. He received 3 years of strict probation, was ordered to pay restitution, and was forced to declare personal bankruptcy. Alyssa filed for divorce 6 weeks after the court hearing, taking what little remained of their personal property and moving back to Boston.
"You didn't want my help, David," I whispered, looking down at him with tears filling my own eyes. "You wanted to erase your mother's memory. You wanted to bulldoze the land that fed you. You wanted to declare your father insane just to line your pockets with quick cash." I picked up my wool coat and pulled it over my shoulders. "You thought you were smarter than your old father," I said softly, holding Julianne's terrified gaze. "You thought age made a man weak, but age makes a man patient. Your mother and I built this legacy to protect our family, not to rescue greedy children from their own moral failure. You wanted ownership of the farm? You have it. You own the title, but you will never sell a single square inch of your mother's dirt." I turned my back on my children. I walked out of the conference room alongside Mark and Arthur Vance, leaving David's desperate wailing and Julianne's frantic, hysterical screams behind us in the empty hall. The legal and financial consequences were swift, harsh, and absolute. Without the $4.2 million developer payout, David's financial house of cards collapsed within 48 hours. His margin lenders liquidated his investment accounts, and his firm fired him for unauthorized asset pledging. To avoid federal criminal charges for financial fraud, David was forced to sell his personal vehicles, declare bankruptcy, and move into a small rented studio apartment 2 hours away. Julianne's bridge lenders foreclosed on her suburban home 3 months later. Unable to meet her debt obligations, her real estate broker's license was suspended pending an ethics investigation into fraudulent land warranties. Mark filed for divorce shortly after, unable to remain married to a woman who had shown such terrifying, cold-hearted cruelty toward her own father. Dr. Sterling, the cousin who had signed the fake medical evaluation claiming I had executive dysfunction, was reported to the State Medical Licensing Board by Arthur Vance. Following a formal investigation, his medical license was suspended for 6 months, destroying his private practice's reputation. Neither David nor Julianne ever called me again. The shame of their absolute defeat and the exposure of their deceit drove them completely out of my life. They had traded a father's unconditional love and a rich family legacy for a gamble that left them with nothing. Under Mark's dedicated stewardship as trustee and my continued guidance as master grower, Sturming orchards flourished like never before. We expanded our organic pressing operations, hired 4 more local families, and launched a nonprofit agricultural scholarship in Martha's name to help young farmers buy their first acres of land. Mark proved to be the son I had always wanted, hardworking, honest, and deeply respectful of the earth and the community. One crisp, beautiful evening in late October, the annual apple harvest was finally complete. The heavy aroma of sweet, freshly pressed cider and wood smoke hung thick in the cool autumn air. The rumble of tractors had quieted down, and the farm workers had all gone home to their families for the evening. I walked out onto the wooden porch of the farmhouse, carrying 2 warm mugs of hot spiced cider. I handed one to Mark, who was sitting on the top step, wiping sweat from his forehead after unloading the last crate of heirloom apples. "Good harvest, Arthur," Mark said softly, looking out over the endless dark green rows of trees heavily laden with remaining fruit. "Your mother-in-law would have been proud of you, Mark," I said, sitting beside him on the wooden step. "She always said the soil knows who cares for it." Mark smiled, took a slow sip of cider, and stood up. "I'm gonna head home to check on the kids, Arthur. Will you be all right out here alone?" "I'm never alone out here, son. Get home to your family." Mark patted my shoulder and walked down the gravel driveway, his boots crunching softly until his taillights disappeared down the country road. I sat alone on the wooden porch as the evening sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of deep crimson, gold, and soft violet. A cool mountain breeze rustled through the branches of the old northern spy trees my father and I had planted decades ago, making the leaves whisper like old friends sharing secrets in the dark. I reached into my flannel pocket and pulled out an old, worn silver pocket watch, the watch Martha had given me on our wedding day in 1982. I opened the casing and looked at the faded black-and-white photograph inside. Martha was smiling, her eyes bright with hope, standing right in front of the young saplings that had now grown into a mighty, magnificent forest of fruit. I took a slow sip of warm cider, feeling the comforting heat spread through my chest against the evening chill. I had won the battle. I had saved the land, protected my workers, and honored my wife's memory. I had proven that a quiet, patient father could defeat the coldest greed with truth and foresight.
But as I sat there in the quiet stillness of the autumn night, a single heavy tear slipped down my weathered cheek and fell onto the worn glass of Martha's watch. I had saved 90 acres of dirt, but I had lost the 2 children I had rocked to sleep in this very house. I closed the pocket watch with a soft, metallic click, held it tight against my heart, and listened to the wind singing through the quiet, eternal trees of the land I had fought so hard to save.